Today we are interviewing Gary McCann, who retired in August 2003 from the position of Associate Director of American University's Washington College of Law Library. In fact, Gary was my Chief Deputy through most of the 30 years I served as Director there. Gary, I believe those watching or reading this interview would like to know a little bit about you personally. For example, could you begin by telling us a bit about where you were raised and about your family both when you were young and today? Then perhaps could you tell us about your education, including where you went to college, law school, and then to library school?
Well, let's see, I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, but at a young age, first grade, I got an offer from an elementary school out in California, so I moved my family out there. And I went through the rest of school in Fullerton. I graduated from high school with someone in my class, a popular singer, Jackson Brown, which interestingly I didn't know him, and I didn't know I graduated with him until I was 50 and working one evening at the reference desk and found myself with a little lull, and I'd been listening to a Jackson Brown CD that I bought for my 50th birthday, kind of to relive my youth. And I read online that he had graduated from my high school. And my immediate reaction was it couldn't be, but I went home and looked in my annual, and there he was. I'm the middle of 5 children. My father was a grocer, and my mother never worked outside the home except to proctor the playground. And there, she, for ball fans, she proctored, among other students, Gary Carter. And as a kid, she had to let other kids allow Gary Carter to play baseball with them because he was so good that if he was chosen for one team, kids didn't want to play on the other team. And I remember my mother saying that Gary Carter, he should become a ball player when he grows up. Now, I don't ever remember my mother saying, Gary, you should become a law librarian. But of course I did. I went to Cal State Fullerton, the college in my hometown, and there I met my wife Cheryl. I'm gay, but my first marriage was to Cheryl. Then I went to Willamette University Law School in Oregon. Cheryl went to library school during that time at the University of Oregon, and then we moved to Texas. And I went to library school at the University of Texas, and she went to law school there. We eventually separated and divorced as friends. I worked at Seton Hall for 1 year, and then I moved to DC, where I began working for you, Pat, and there I met Todd, my other half, now for 27 years. And we were married on our 25th anniversary in Washington, D.C. after the district had legalized marriage.
Now could you focus on a little bit about how you decided to become a law librarian? You said you went to law school at Willamette, and I know the director there at the time was Jatine Mukherjee, who was later the director at Seton Hall, where you worked before coming to America after you had your degrees.
That's right.
So perhaps he had a role in recruiting you into the field, or perhaps you came about some other way. Could you talk a little bit about that, and maybe mention also a little from your experience at the University of Texas, where you worked somewhat under the mentorship, or at least under the directorship of Roy Mirsky, who's acknowledged as one of the great leaders and mentors of his generation in our field.
Yes. Well, my beginning of my interest in librarianship actually goes back to when I was getting my BA at Cal State Fullerton. And I had in mind from high school that I maybe would go to law school. Wasn't anything certain in my mind, but something that I thought about. I talked to my parents' lawyer about it when I was in high school. And when I was in college, I dated a woman who was working in the college library, and while I dated her, she went to library school and became a librarian. And I remember that I kidded her about it a lot, as, you know, librarian jokes are, you know, and so that was a fun whatever thing between us. But I also noticed that she enjoyed her work, and I started thinking, you know, maybe I would like to be a librarian. And I also had, though, in my head that this idea that I was going to go to law school, and somehow the idea that if I didn't go to law school, I might always wonder what my life would have been like if I'd gone to law school and become a lawyer. Well, when I started looking at law school catalogs, I noticed that all the law schools that I looked at had librarians who had law degrees as well as library degrees. So I thought, well, I'll go to law school, and if I want to become a lawyer, I'll do that, but I can always go to library school too and become a law librarian. When I was in law school, I started working in the law library in my second semester. I went into Jatine's office and told him I was somewhat interested in librarianship and whatever. Anyhow, the library was always hiring part-time staff, and I quickly became, you know, one of the student workers who worked a lot of hours and basically looked after a lot of things. What I found then was that I really enjoyed basically running the circulation desk. It was a small library and we didn't have a reference desk. So I also probably answered more reference questions than I ever should have, but there were times, particularly weekends, when I was the only person in the library. And so I did the best I could. Anyhow, I enjoyed that, and I started thinking that really I wanted to be a librarian, and I started questioning whether I wanted to spend 2 more years in law school and a year in library school, and also whether I wanted to pay all that money, which at the time was an astounding $1,100 a semester, which now of course seems amazing. But so I thought about it, and I had the idea that I would at least take off a semester and work full-time to get some more money and consider what I really wanted to do, whether maybe I wanted to be a public librarian. And it was Jatine who first of all hired me, who said, if you're going to take off, you know, I can find a position for you here for the semester. And during that semester, he gave me projects. One was actually checking the collection against AALL lists. And he encouraged me, you know, he said, you should finish the law degree and be a law librarian. He simply nudged me in that direction, and it seemed reasonable enough. And so that's basically what I did. I also, helping in that direction, even I'd say, is that my part-time job in law school, which had been in the law library, well, another opportunity came up, and it was to go to work in the publication attorney's office for the Oregon legislature, Oregon Legislative Council office. And that came up because I worked in the library. Someone came across the street, one of the students who worked for the Legislative Council office, and she said, well, I thought of you because I know that you're interested in librarianship. And what they were doing at that time was undertaking a revision of the Oregon Revised Code the Legislative Council office was revising the whole code and renumbering it, but they also wanted the whole thing re-indexed. So I became a part, as a law student, as part of an indexing unit. So I did that, and then when I graduated from law school, I was pleased the Legislative Council came to our office one day and asked me if I would stay on after I graduated. So I was like, well, this is wonderful. And that too, though, I think was in part because he knew I was interested in going into librarianship. And he was hoping simply to keep the staff around who were interested to get the code finished. And so I did that. I told him, well, I did plan to go to library school in a year. And he said, well, you know, that's fine. If you want to leave then, you know, there's no obligation in that. So I did that, and that was, you know, a great start for me career-wise. Then an interesting thing that happened too, that has to do with all of the rest of my life, is that during that period when I was working on the Oregon revised code, revising it, and I indexed the bill that the legislature had passed for the Heimlich maneuver, which is it was a law that required all staff in restaurants know how to perform the Heimlich maneuver. Sorry. So, about a year later, I was in library school in Austin, Texas. I hadn't even lived there 3 months, I think. And Cheryl, my ex-wife, my wife at the time, and I were out having dinner. We were probably doing all the things that you're taught as little kids you shouldn't do while you're eating. We were laughing and joking, and we were eating beef. I was having beef stroganoff. And the next thing I knew, I couldn't breathe. And I thought, oh my God, and I couldn't swallow. And then I thought, I know what's happening. And the only thing I think that saved my life is that I stood up and put my hands above my head and started walking around this restaurant. And eventually a waitress saw me and she shouted across the room, "Can you breathe? Are you choking?" And I shook my head yes to the choking question. She ran over and administered the Heimlich maneuver. And if I hadn't indexed that bill in Oregon, I probably would have just sat at that table and choked to death. At the University of Texas, I worked some for Roy Mirsky. A funny story, though, is that I was sort of naive about law librarianship in general. I knew I had made a choice to go to Texas rather than to go up to the University of Washington, but I'd done that really because of the weather and because my sister lived in Galveston. And my ex-wife Cheryl and I had visited Joy in Galveston, and we thought, oh, after 4 years in the Oregon rain, it would be nice to live in the sun for a while. And of course, Cheryl had her library degree. We stopped in when we visited Austin just to inquire, and we met Roy Mirsky, and he said that he would probably be able to find a job for her, as he did when we got there. Well, at that point, I was thinking I wanted to get through library school in a year, and I wasn't really planning to work. I just thought I'll go to library school, and I, of course, would take Roy's class. But so it was second semester before I got to his class, and there, of course, I gradually learned, oh, Roy is a real mentor and really interested in working with people and placing them out in the field. And so it was like, oh, I had once again landed in a good place, or as with the Oregon Legislative Council office, I really hadn't put much thought into it. I was sort of a doofus stumbling along, but there I was. When I finished library school, too, it was a different time than so many years later and probably now. Getting a job wasn't really so hard. I had 3 job interviews and got 3 offers from those. The one that I chose to go with was actually not to be a permanent job, but to work for Jatin Mukherjee again. He had moved by that time to Seton Hall, and I thought living in New York City would be fun for a short time anyhow, and I just thought, you know, I feel like doing it, and I think I'll just do this. And even when I'd been in library school, I remember thinking, I actually had the fantasy, I said, oh, wouldn't it be good if Jatin had an opening? And one day I was sitting at home studying, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and a woman's voice, a lovely, gracious, graceful voice that I came to know quite well over the time I would be there. Anyhow, she simply said to me, Jatin Mukherjee is on the line, will you hold please? And I said, sure, and Jatin had an opening. And so I thought then, well, yes, this is what I'll do. And so that is how I really got into the field, and Seton Hall was my first law library job.
Well, your next job was at American University, where I happened to be the director, and you became, or were hired to be the number 2 librarian in the place, which as associate director, role you had for probably about 25 years until you had been planning to retire, and I decided I'd retire the same day. So we retired at exactly the same day. And it was an interesting experience. Now, one of the things about American that's a little different from many law libraries, libraries in general, is that the librarians are tenure track and tenured faculty. So you and I probably worked in an environment where we were not, in the traditional sense, the boss and the next to the boss, but rather we were more like academic deans working with herding of cats, as it's sometimes been described.
Oh, yes.
And working with faculty.
I would say definitely
We had
herding cats.
all the librarians, by the time we left, that had been there a long time. They were all tenured. They were all wonderful at their work and so on. But it was a different kind of leadership role that we played. Do you have any thoughts, or would you like to comment about that experience, perhaps?
Well, I think first of all, the herding cats is exactly what it amounts to. And, you know, in library school, I remember that we were taught in a management class, you create a job and then hire somebody to fit the job. You do not cater jobs to people. But the reality in life is that in so many situations, it seems to me, you know, you have people, they're there. And in our case, of course, we basically were in a tenure track system, and people became tenured. And you're there over time, over a number of years, and it seems to me that the reality is that I think part of what we did that I really liked is that we did cater jobs to people, and that we basically, in my view, looked at our fellow librarians and thought, well, who's good at what and who likes to do what, and to the best of our ability, arrange things so that people were doing what they were good at and what they liked to do. Now, in a library, certain things have to happen. And so, of course, we can't all do just what we want to do, you know. But I think the system, to me, works. We worked as a committee as a whole. And I think you and I were both very comfortable with it, and that that tone, and the tone that you set, basically of results-oriented, not concerned with how we got to results. And I know for me, there were times when I would look at things that maybe people were doing and I would think to myself, well, I don't know why they're doing it that way. I wouldn't do it that way, but the results seem to be fine. And so I sometimes even might say to myself, well, I don't know that I could get better results if I personally were doing it and doing it the way I think I would do it. And so I think that makes for an interesting style. I will say it seems to me it can be, I think it's more work but gets better results in a way, because it might be easier to be the boss and simply tell people how you want things done, and I suppose in a corporate structure simply fire people who don't do them the way you want them done, although then you're constantly having to break in new people. But anyhow, in a system where you're really a group of colleagues, you're basically a committee of the whole solving problems. I would go into a lot of meetings probably with, in my own mind, what outcome I wanted, just as much as my colleagues were coming in with the outcomes they wanted in their mind. And so we really would have a lot of tug of wars. And part of the management style that we were running was basically letting go and saying, well, except in extreme instances, my vote really doesn't count anymore. I'm going to trust that the group as a whole will make the better decision. Now, obviously, if a system like that, if you have somebody in there who's a slacker or incompetent, you do have a problem. But in our situation, that problem never arose. And you know, some folks say, oh, well, the tenure system, it's just the system that lets people get tenured and then they think they don't have to do anything. Of the 9 librarians that we worked with over the years, I don't think a single person let up a single bit after they were tenured. In fact, if anything, as we all grew older, I think we just became more intense in our work. I want to mention a couple other things too, that when you and I first met, when I came for my interview at American University, I remember I learned a insignificant to a lot of people little fact, but basically that you allowed eating and drinking in the library. And I remember, I don't know whether at the interview, but early on, you and I both confessed that, well, during law school, we had both snuck our lunches into the library. I mean, I ate my lunch in the library all the time, even though it was against the rules. And I thought, this to me makes so much sense. And I felt then that, along with some other things, that there was a meeting of minds here. And of course, it's a meeting of minds that turned out to be very accurate perception that 25 years later, I think we felt even more of one mind and closer for the years that we had had a similar outlook. When I came to, it's interesting how different time was and how things changed in schools. WCL, the Washington College of Law, when I got there, was kiddingly nicknamed Wine and Cheese in the Lobby. Because it was just a different time. Colleges had not yet discovered all the legal problems involved in serving alcohol. And so it's funny to think back about it. Smoking. I mean, we had a smoking section in the library. I also remember that it was not unheard of for the night staff to report that they had smelled marijuana in the stairways. That too, it was simply the times. Things were different. I'm thinking too about some things that we did, and one of the big projects right away was moving the library. And we would move the library again, maybe it was 18 years later or so. And in that move, I remember that the card catalog at one point fell off I don't know what you call it, an elevator.
It was an outside the building temporary
An
lift.
outside the building.
Bring the heavy stuff up in a window, yes.
And they took the card catalog out the window, and I don't remember how it happened, but I remember
Several drawers had dropped to the ground.
cards all over, sort of.
Yeah.
And that was one of the traumas. I think we also had some trouble with book stacks that weren't properly secured in the end. or
Oh, I
something.
remember that.
Yeah.
We were loading the books, or the movers were loading the books down the aisle, which of course is on one side of the stack, and then the things started to lean, and they could have basically pushed each other over. We had to shore them up. You learn very quickly as an administrator to take charge and get it fixed, and I got a hold of the physical plant people, and they came up and were able to secure them to the ceiling as well, which
Right.
eliminated the problem, but it was a little bit scary that afternoon, as I recall as well.
Yeah. I remember in our second move to the new building, altogether new building, or well, it was a building that the law school bought to turn into the law school, including the law library. And I remember that that move seemed to me somehow more work. Well, we did it at Christmas time, right?
Mhm.
I think that's why it seemed like more work, come to think of it, because we were marching around. I remember one of our colleagues saying she felt like the Energizer bunny from the ads. And I remember during that period coming in the morning, and I would feel like later in the day I would realize I had not touched my chair. I had just been walking around the library doing things that really involved and getting the move settled. And then I remember that somehow a leak sprung. I don't remember what happened. Did a sprinkler go off?
It was a fire sprinkler that had burst because it was too close to an outside wall of the building and wasn't properly insulated. So suddenly we had this water coming in. Yes.
And I remember personally, internally, I had this emotional reaction to it. I thought, oh my, this is our new building. I mean, I felt like a shop owner who just moved into a new store, and all of a sudden, part of it is being, I knew it wasn't being permanently ruined, but I was like, oh boy, that was a setback, I thought. Also, as I think over my years in librarianship, I think, well, when I came to America, I really had a lot of learning to do. And, you know, when I think of myself in years later, however little I knew of what I was doing, I knew so much more than I had known in the beginning. And of course, I learned a lot from you, and I learned a lot from experience. And I can look back and think, well, I wish I'd been more mature when I got there, but I think that's just life. I think one of the things that made all those years interesting, and probably in general, I think other law librarians maybe feel this way, is you never know quite what's going to happen during a day. I never would know what problem was going to come up from faculty, from students, from other staff. Now, admittedly, there were some days when if you'd asked me at the time, I would have said, oh, just to have a day when no problem came up. But the reality is, I loved administration and I loved solving the problems. And so that kept the work always interesting to me, going in and not knowing what was going to happen. And I think, I would say, I tried not to take work home, but I don't think I was ever good at that, not emotionally. And I'm probably, it's just part of my personality. Whatever I'm doing, I sort of plunge into it. And I know a lot of weekends even. I remember a weekend at the beach when Todd and I had gone away. It was Saturday afternoon around 4 when I took a long hot shower that I finally, in my head, solved some problem. I don't even have any idea what it was now. Some problem, I solved it in my mind anyhow, as to what I was going to do on Monday morning about something. Now, when it got to Monday morning, maybe I didn't do that at all even. I don't even remember because, again, the fluidity of the place, the colleagues that we had to both rely on and to deal with, because sometimes people aren't happy and you have to sort of find out, well, why aren't they happy? What's going on here? So that
I think what you're describing is why I always saw you as a very accomplished deputy. You solve problems. You resolve problems through working one-on-one with other colleagues in ways that I thought demonstrated tremendous skill and common sense.
Well,
and I think that's the role. And you say, you know, at the very beginning, you didn't have some of the maturity that comes from experience. Well, we're all in that category as we start out, and that's not a problem, because if you're sensitive and grow with the job, that's where all this eventually comes.
yeah, well, thank you. I think there are people who would say, you're telling that jackass he has common sense? Well, it's nice to hear.
That's the deputy's job to the director, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tell that jackass.
That makes me think a thing that I did always appreciate, and I always knew in working for you, that I always knew I could come to you and say, Pat, that idea you have, it's really not very good, this particular idea, and you would listen and change it and do something different.
I was always in favor of stealing good ideas from any source I could get them, and so if you came to me with something that sounded like it made more sense than my thinking, I was delighted to try it.
Yeah, good. It was nice.
Yeah.
I always felt our goal was to maximize the satisfaction of all of the library users, faculty and students, actually, and the staff also, as well as we could. In other words, when you're dealing with a large group of people, a large number of students, large number of faculty, and a large staff, you can't maximize everybody's satisfaction on everything, but you can maximize their satisfaction. They may not see it as being maximized, but in other words, within the constraints of what needed to happen to run a library, and what needed to happen to balance resources between one person and another, that I always saw as our goal. Interesting little aspects along the way. One of the things that I learned early on, to my surprise, was that a lot of young staff are more rigid than I would think. And I felt that I did spend a lot of my time trying to get staff to be a little flexible with the rules. And I know our basic approach and outlook was, what we want to do is send library users off with a sense of satisfaction with their transaction with the library, whatever it was. And of course, we differentiated between students and faculty. I always saw our relationship to the faculty as that of a private firm library to its lawyers. And of course, I have to say about that too, we had wonderful support, I think, support you got from the law school. In other words, we were running an interlibrary loan operation that could, anytime we wanted, call a messenger and send the messenger across town to pick up something, which is a privilege that private firms have, but in a lot of academic situations they just wouldn't have that. But we did. But anyhow, I did feel that that was one of the surprises about work. We had lovely staff. I mean, we were really blessed. Part of it is because we hired so many law students, and we couldn't compete around town salary-wise, but when you accounted for tuition remission, it became a good job. And I think we were very supportive of our staff and mindful of the fact that they're in law school and that their law school has to be balanced against their working life. And so we were able to get their support, I think 100%, because they knew when it got to exam time and bar exam time, they would have our support. And so it was a good situation, and so many of our staff, I just felt they were such basically brilliant kids and generally hard workers, overachievers, so that made working with them a pleasure. And of course, more often I usually actually did supervise at least one staffer, and it was usually a pleasure, always a pleasure, even if there were moments that were that might be difficult, as any situation can be. I mean, I do remember along the way having to dismiss a staff member, and I also remember another staff member that I had to basically tell him, you know, this probably isn't the right job for you, and unless you can improve your performance, you know, we're going to have to dismiss you. And my memory is he left. But other than those two exceptions, it seems to me everyone else was, at least they were B to A plus as far as performance. And I remember at least one funny story about supervising is that we would, in the public services department, we often passed people around somewhat as supervisors. In other words, again, with keeping life interesting, whatever, we'd be changing job descriptions. So, for instance, I'm thinking now of interlibrary loan. And I remember we had one interlibrary loan person who was there for a pretty lengthy period, a few years, who had reported to at least two different librarians in the public services department, and was about to be reassigned so he would report to me. And I remember going to him with one of my colleagues and one of our colleagues and saying to him, well, listen, we've decided this time you're going to be supervised by somebody who works in the department store across the street. And so that was. And my last, I remember my last direct supervision was of our interlibrary loan person who was a law student, a hardworking young woman, and I would meet with her once a week at noon, and I would ask her about the week. She knew that she could come to me anytime. I mean, I always made clear to her, if there's ever any problem, if you can't find something, if a faculty member wants something this afternoon and you can't find it anywhere and can't get a messenger, you know, somewhere that you can send a messenger, tell me. If there's, you know, if somebody gives you a list of 200 books or 200 items and, you know, there's a problem, you can't get them, you know, this afternoon, and anyhow, in other words, I would always go to a faculty member if I needed to and sit down and talk to them and say. But those instances almost never came up. So anyhow, my supervision amounted to a very pleasant meeting at noon every Friday, in which we would first talk about the interlibrary loan operation. Were there any problems? What's the ebb and flow this week? Who's doing what research? And then we would talk a little about law school, how she was doing, how she was feeling about it, I would learn about her professors, who were professors, of course, that we served, and then it would be always interesting to hear about her take on classroom with them. And so it was just a complete delight, and that, I would say, was generally my feeling about supervising staff, and also about the work atmosphere. I remember at one point too, we had a new circulation supervisor, and she was a lot tougher and stricter than some of ours had been, although we'd had some that were pretty tough too. But anyhow, and that was a lesson, I think, for a lot of us as reference librarians who were used to meddling in circulation business, because we were sitting at one end of the same desk, and it took a little while to get used to basically being told to butt out. And I thought at the time even, well, I'm not sure whether this is good or bad, but I decided, you know, she doesn't report directly to me. She's working hard. She's doing the best she can as she sees it. And her supervisor's satisfied. And so I thought, this is one of those occasions when I need to do what she's saying, to basically butt out of circulation. And so I just think it made life so much more interesting to try to bring out the best in people, let people go and see how they're going to do things. And you know, only if a person realizes, well, somebody's giving out bad information, or they're making people mad, if you know, again, maximizing satisfaction. I'd always made clear to all of our staff that they would never be called down, never be criticized for basically giving something away. We might say to them, well, don't do that again, and go into our offices and wring our hands and say, oh my God, what did they do? But we basically always wanted them to send people away satisfied as much as possible. And if there was no way on earth they could be satisfied, then it would come to us and we would deal with it in some way to satisfy them. And I always wanted to make clear to staff, and did make clear to them, that I would always back them up as long as they were working towards satisfaction. It would be a different matter if they sent people away mad, that my goal would be to satisfy them. And so I wanted to make clear that this is what needs to be done here. This is how we operate. So, and I think people got it pretty early. Sometimes I think it made them angry. Sometimes student workers especially thought, well, why do the faculty get to do this, that, and the other, and students don't? But it's a hierarchical life, and in a law school, the law faculty are, in my opinion, like the senior partners in a law firm. They basically call the shots, in that, you know, obviously the librarian stands up to them in that at times and as need be, and keeps them in line, and in your case, very cleverly, I think, handled the faculty.
Thank you.
So that, you know, everything worked out so smoothly.
Gary, you, for a number of years, played a major leadership role in the Law Librarians Society of Washington, D.C., which is approximately 500 to 600 members, as I recall, and the largest chapter and one of the oldest chapters of the American Association of Law Libraries. I remember you had issues with management, how it could be done, and the fact that many of the librarians couldn't devote the time that some of us in academic life could. And you worked with that issue and some of the others. You want to talk a little bit about some of that experience?
Yeah, my year as president of the Law Librarian Society was its 50th anniversary year. So I'd have to say that basically it was just a year of fun and celebration. I mean, I can't think of any real problems that came up. It was a tremendous amount of work that I really enjoyed. It was like running a small company. And I think maybe anyone who's chaired a committee even knows the feeling that I used to get this strange feeling about going to our board meetings, because as we'd go through the meeting, there would always come up a number of subjects that the board would generally agree that something needs to be done about this. And so I would write it down. And I always came away feeling like, oh, here's my list of things that I need to do next. And that's more or less how it seems to me committees work. I guess sometimes as the chair and as the president, I would of course ask people to do things, and we had lots of committees who did things, but so many of the things that seemed to me that came up in board meetings were basically things that the president needed to deal with one way or the other. But it was a fun year. I remember one part of our celebration was at the AALL Reno convention. We had a midnight champagne cake party for the 50th, to celebrate the 50th birthday of the chapter. And in fact, my other half, Todd, led us in singing "Happy Birthday to the Society." And it was I think a fun time was had by all. That makes me think of AALL meetings in general, and how much I enjoyed those. And Todd came to many of them if he could. He came along, and in fact he liked to go to what was called the Chocolate SIS, which was a group of people who got together and went around whatever town it was, and ate chocolate at some point during the convention. And then we would share a room with our colleague Darlene Weingarth, who had worked in our shop and left to go become the law librarian for the territory of Guam. And she was an amazing person, because Darlene had a kidney transplant when she was in her 20s and had basically kidney disease, and yet she never let it stop her from doing anything, including in Guam. She learned to skydive and to fly a plane. She, at one of our conventions, I remember arriving, and this shows how naive I am about some things. And I arrived in the room, and Darlene was ironing when I opened the door and came in. And I said, "Oh, Darlene, an ironing board. Where'd you get that?" Because I never ironed, and I had no idea. And she said, very straight-faced, "I brought it with me." And I said, "Darlene, you brought an ironing board on the plane from Guam?" And she said, "Yeah, there was no problem." I said, "Well, how'd you get through the airport?" And she said, "Well, I strapped it to my back." And we went through the entire convention, and I just thought this was what had happened. And we got to the end of the convention, and I went to the room, and I noticed at one point, I think it was maybe the evening of the closing banquet that afternoon, I said, "Oh, where'd the ironing board go?" And Darlene said, "Well, they took it back." And I said, "Who?" And she said, "Well, the hotel." And she said, "Gary, you didn't really believe I brought an ironing board from Guam, did you? Hotels have ironing boards." That I'd never noticed before. And I guess at other conventions she'd iron clothes. I just never thought about it. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, so that, but it was a joy to go to those conventions and see everybody, and to spend time with a colleague who was halfway around the world.
Thank you, Gary McCann, for allowing us to visit with you today, and for taking these few moments to talk about yourself and thoughts on the profession. Before closing, is there anything that you would like to talk about at this point?
No, I can't think of anything else.
Covered pretty much the whole waterfront.
Covered, yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, I do appreciate your time today, and so we'll
Well,
Yeah.
thank you for asking me.
Okay.
It's fun to be a part of the project.
Okay.